Many people have problems with art and not with reality.
A way to sort of cause trouble.
Yeah, it does something strange with your head.
Welcome to the Undergang Armchair.
Bring it.
All right, yes indeed. This is Ando, and welcome back to another episode of the Undergang Armchair Podcast. It's actually a lie. It's not another episode. It's a rerun, because I just got back from 4 weeks of traveling, and it's going to be hard for us to get It's going to take us a little while to get it together here. I haven't really been able to talk to anybody for 4 weeks. I've been out and about. I won that little prize, which makes me get a lot more emails, so to speak. But, my cousin says I have to be more upbeat in my speaking. So, hi. Hello. How is everybody? I'm actually really excited to share this episode with you guys today. It's Joseph Griffiths. He's an Australian artist who lived here in Denmark for 9 months. He's really talented, bright artist. He is an amazing drawer, and he also makes installations. He's made drawing machines. He showed at the Esbjerg Art Museum, and recently this year was part of the Sydney Biennial back in Australia. And he's also an amazingly articulate fellow. I love talking to him. He became a friend of mine because he was one of the most amazing people to talk about anything, about art, about critical ideas, about surfing, whatever it was. Such a bright and inquisitive fellow, and so therefore I think this talk is one of the best we've had. The only other news before we go into it is that there is actually now an app available for this show. Kind of. It's released through the host for this program, so it's for iOS at the moment. It's for Apple devices. A Android one will be coming out later. And what you do is you go to the App Store and you search for Podcast Box, and it's a free program. And then once you get in there, you can search for this show, and it pops up, and it costs $2. $2. That was the cheapest price we could choose. And if you buy it, we get $1. I guess we'll be moving to Bermuda soon or something like that. So that'll be great. That'll be nice. Anyways, enjoy the talk with Joseph. The guy certainly knows what he's talking about, and you can enjoy listening to me try to keep up with him. All right. I found it interesting that you guys just kind of showed up here and jumped in, you and your girlfriend. We're just like, okay, we're here, it's on now. Because in my experience, most immigrants who come here, I don't mean immigrants, most people who visit and come and try to work or go to school or something find it quite jarring. They have a lot of trouble coming into it. What was your experience like landing here, and what was your idea before you came, and what was it like after you came?
Not sure what my idea was before I came.
Did you think about Denmark
I'm not
as a
sure
country?
it was very formulated, to be honest. I mean, I've been here once for 5 days, so I kind of knew basically what the inner city area looked like around Copenhagen.
Well, it helps you had a picture in your head.
Yeah, definitely. A close friend of mine from my time in high school has lived here for the past few years, so that ended up being quite important, I guess. It definitely put us in touch with a network of people straight away.
Tell you how things worked, etc.
I'd also, last time I was here, though it was brief, had met with these with N55, the art collective based in Christianshavn. Because I was very interested in some projects that they were doing that kind of mixed together art and architecture and urban occupation in a way that was neither kind of authorized, but wasn't overly antagonistic either, in that kind of activist sort of way. It was just like really interesting projects.
What do they
that
do?
engaged the ideas of how we used urban spaces.
Okay.
And I was interested in vernacular architecture and that sort of thing. Like we'd been traveling a lot when we came here, and I'd been really getting off on like Neolithic buildings and all kinds of old stone buildings in the south of France, and different kinds of ways that you could trace how people had lived in other times, and maybe what their kind of styles were like, and the kind of visual identity of the people was somehow in the buildings. I was interested in all that. And then I came to Copenhagen, and these guys were making houses that walked with robotic legs, and houses which floated, and thought about different ways of occupying urban space, or taking it for yourself, reclaiming it for yourself in zones that were kind of, nomadic, or had a sort of element of something more ancient, that weren't kind of carefully controlled already by legislation. And that's one of the biggest problems in like Australia, is that and I dare say in the States, is that things are so heavily regulated, and so there's such a wariness about the legal implication of taking risks that most businesses and institutions and things just simply aren't willing to take risks.
And you don't feel that here as much?
No, I don't.
I mean, because that's the whole beef with so-called socialist countries, is that everything's overregulated.
Yeah, look, maybe I'm not in a position to see it for what it is, but I definitely think that what I have seen is that like they're more willing to test things,
I agree.
and they've got a pragmatic kind of approach to difference or to change.
Well, I think here there's a willingness to put money into attempts, without
definitely
proving that anything could work or happen.
Well, I think that's the strategy, isn't it? And I think that's something which we should learn from. I mean, certainly in Australia, political bodies don't take risks and that sort of thing. And we haven't seen too many examples of, certainly not when it comes to urban space usage and stuff,
right.
Beyond superficial kind of pop-up,
sure.
Urban space things.
Perhaps.
But like in terms of like, saying, all right, maybe it's a good idea if people had collective ownership over their apartment building,
right.
Rather than have to pay these extreme mortgages. Maybe we'll test that in one suburb for a set amount of time and see how it goes, or we'll give that right to one building and just test it.
But I think that stuff happened organically here.
Quite possibly.
I
find it kind of inspirational.
Yeah.
The fact that there's some willingness, at least, to...
I just don't understand how they avoid the rhetoric, because let's take America, for example. Perhaps if you wanted to throw tax money at a project which may very well fail, a walking house, for example, that's a great example, a walking house. You are, as soon as there's any sort of media or public eye shined upon this, going to face a howling storm, a shitstorm, if I may, of people yelling about misappropriation of public money. And like, I don't understand how they avoid that debate here. And I understand there are some voices who say that, but there seems to be a general consensus. It's money well spent to a degree. There's a lot of debate here. There's a lot of talking back and forth. They're very earnest. But in the U.S., it would collapse under the weight of the shitstorm it created.
I mean, I think, it's very difficult, not really being a Danish speaker to understand the subtleties of the interface between the state and the political structure and the media and how that plays off. I mean, I can't really say anything about that, but I think when I first got here, and something that seems to have stayed with me, was that a few people told me that the way they described their thoughts about politics and about Denmark as a nation reflected like a real separation, like a psychological or philosophical separation between the government and then the state itself. I suppose meaning the public service, or those people who kind of are the so-called machine of the country.
Right.
And that impressed me in a way, because most of the most of the, I think, reasoning behind, certainly behind political parties being unwilling to try things out, is that they don't want to risk votes. And there's very little separation in Australia, if any, between an idea of the state as a working entity that's separate from the government. You know, that if you can imagine that the country's a large a large whaling vessel or something, and the government just happened to be the crew captaining it for that short period of time. I don't think that we separate that like that, and I think it's actually very useful to think about the government and the state as separate, even if it's a leap of faith in a way.
That makes a lot of sense.
Because the idea that that a country can be kind of something you could be proud of and believe in without believing in the people running it, or that perhaps that the people running it aren't as consequential to the greater scheme as they may make themselves seem, or the media make them seem. And, that makes sense because the way that legislation changes is quite small and incremental, and governments make huge hoo-has when they, change like very small details from the Constitution or from any kind of law. And I think that, on the whole, countries are sort of running on their own a little bit. They're still going to get from A to B somehow. It's just how far off course they're steered, perhaps. And I think it's probably worth younger countries considering that.
That there's an entity that exists outside of the elected officials. Definitely.
And I mean, Australia has a pretty strong identity complex, I think, and being, having a very small population. I mean, I can only really talk about the cultural areas, but, I've got a huge history of anybody who's sort of seriously involved in a career in the cultural fields, whether it be visual arts or music or theatre or film or anything, all go to Europe or the States or somewhere else. Anyone who's kind of serious have traditionally, I mean, I'm talking for the last, well, probably 100 years, but let's say 50. That's been a massive... certainly since the sort of advent of like easy plane travel, people just flee, because there's not enough.
And they don't come back, or what?
Some do, some don't. Most probably maintain some connection and all that sort of stuff. But I think the point is that a lot of the kind of cultural production that gives people something to be proud of comes in some ways from being together. And if people keep leaving, then it's hard for that kind of that sort of the cultural sense of the identity to grow, because the political sense, the sense of identity or the idea of a state that's separate from the government, I think has to do with believing that you've even got a nation. We've had such kind of our kind of recent racial history and all that kind of thing is etched pretty close to the surface for us. I think even if most people don't think about it like that, I think that there's been some reasons for that it's been difficult for us to really band together and kind of take some pride. And nationalism's very unpopular and for good reason in many cases. But
where in Denmark or in Australia?
Globally, I think post World War II,
it's kind of popular.
Well, it is popular in America, but it's I think that might be
a mixed bag, to be honest. But
I think that might be a bit of an anomaly. I mean, I don't know that it's very popular elsewhere I've been.
Right.
I mean, certainly. The intellectual elite
shamed more.
All tend to like to rag on their countries
a
lot of the time because they see the problems and they're critical and they think about the world. But I think Australia's got a lot to be proud of, and I think certainly with this very we're a great example, for example, of a global country. And I mean we've got a very good, at least in the cities, a very good balance of representation from around the world, people of all nationalities, and those cultures are actually starting to take hold and develop their own communities in a really good way. Not in, sometimes obviously there's problems, but
everywhere.
But the culture is getting enriched very immediately by the immigration to the country, the migration to the country.
Let me ask you this, because you have on several occasions told me that Australia has some sort of minority complex, you know?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, do you think it's kind of unfounded in a way? Because it seems like, you know, okay, take a country like Denmark. Everyone knows where Australia is. Everyone has a picture in their head. If you say Australia, they imagine something, be it something as cheesy as kangaroos and Ayers Rock, which I know isn't called that anymore. You know, put a shrimp on the Barbie, whatever totally generic bullshit you want to say. But if you name a country like Denmark, they won't necessarily have a picture in their head. And Danes do have a minority complex too, but you've mentioned this several times. I mean, when you grew up in Australia, did you feel like, oh, this is a second-rate country?
No, not really. No. I think the minority complex, I think it comes partly from being, from being a small population in some ways and always looking to somewhere else for our lead. You know, people haven't really. It's difficult to generalize, which I don't usually have trouble with. But since we're recording this, I kind of want to do it justice. I mean,
I got you.
I mean, the minority complex, I think, arises mostly in political situations and in terms of global politics. And sadly, we haven't shown enough leadership thus far in terms of our own ethics. And yeah, I mean, our culture is very dominated by capital, so we tend to go where will serve us best economically.
As most countries are.
Yeah, more than anything else, and that's a bit of a shame in my view.
I feel like I kind of just came up with this on the spot, but maybe it's true. I feel like the countries which have historically been in the shadows, the Western countries, like Denmark, or I hesitate to say Australia, but kind of somewhat along the lines of Australia, Sweden, I don't know, Luxembourg, wherever. Like, it's kind of their hour to shine now. Like the big cultural powerhouses, you know, like America, for example, is kind of losing their edge. You know, if you look at like most desirable cities to live in and general happiness indexes and all that stuff, it seems to be shifting away from the world leaders of the 90s, you know?
Yeah, but I think...
I mean, like you said,
I think critical mass is important.
Yeah.
You know...
but it's coming. I feel like it's coming.
Maybe. There was a really interesting project, artistic project set up by Kevin Murray, an Australian specialist and academic in the craft area, but also in the visual arts more broadly, who set up a very interesting project that was about creating strong cultural links between countries of the Southern Hemisphere. Particularly in the southern countries of Africa, South America, Australia, New Zealand, some of the Pacific Islands, and etc. And it was extremely interesting to me when I first encountered it, and I knew him and volunteered for it at one point. The idea of Australia, this huge floating mass in the south of everywhere that just feels remote from anywhere, being part of a collective was quite a cool idea. I thought it was just a nice conceptual leap to make, and perhaps, you know, I could see something similar being useful in Scandinavia. I know it already kind of is economically and politically that they have certain treaties and things which apply to them, and where they kind of co-support one another, or at least in some ways
they have a relationship with each other.
Yeah, and I think that's. I mean, I think that the main reason that Paris, London, New York have been such important cultural centers is just because they're massive, you know. And from my experience, if you're living in a city of 10 million people, and 1% of the population are interested in what you're into, that's quite a lot of people.
Sure, but
and that means that you have the possibility for a kind of level of critical discourse and a level of engagement and a level of, you've got a big enough niche market also to sustain a kind of economy around your niche interests. So if it's the art world, like as we're saying, I agree in one hand that, that these cultural centres are in the global age forced to look abroad, certainly to Asia and to the developing world, because those are very high contrast, the kind of work that's coming out from those places. But even the more culturally close countries like the Scandinavian countries or Australia and New Zealand, perhaps even Eastern European countries to some extent, that while they'll be looked to for kind of new energy, perhaps as the big cities, I mean, they're so microcosmic. New York is just a world in unto itself, and you can, like, it feels. I mean, I've only been to New York once for 4 weeks, right? And I still, can kind of recite, the different neighborhoods just of Manhattan, and then I know all of these different little art collectives and things that I've never visited that have popped up all over, like Brooklyn, and I've got this kind of whole accidental knowledge about the New York art scene, which it just has zero to do with my life. And it's just because there's this critical mass that is projecting and has a sort of, it has a kind of
That's a historical thing, though, too.
Well, there's an engine room for saying, hey, this is what we're doing. We're doing this. Hey, everyone, this is what we're doing. And they've attracted, important artists from all over the world. So you get really rich work coming out. But you also have this incredible industry that supports that, because even though it's still a marginal interest, say, in terms of the actual cultural production, it's sustainable in that little microcosmic way. And I don't see that really disappearing. Things can go in and out of favor. Maybe, things become overly commercialized. I think, I've heard a lot of people talking about the demise of the Chelsea art scene or whatever, and, that everyone moved to Brooklyn or something, Right,
and it's too expensive.
And of course these sorts of waves happen, but basically you've got a big, massive engine.
But speaking of a ship with a crew, like that's the kind of thing, it floats on its own, and whoever happens to be scrabbled to the top of the, at the crow's nest, pointing the ship in some direction is doing something, but it runs on its own.
Yeah, but I don't know, it feels very impenetrable to me. It's also a long way away from anywhere I've lived in the recent times, so it feels
impenetrable to me too.
I find it all very intimidating, or I don't mean that in a negative way, just almost uninteresting, because it's so large and of its own. The really interesting thing is what's happening on, what individuals are making in that environment. And I think that if you can pull it off, that being part of an artistic community on that scale must be incredibly rewarding and incredibly invigorating, and push your practice really, really quickly. And I mean, on one hand, I'm kind of envious of that, but...
Did you get the feeling, like I did, that New York has destroyed better men than I? When I was there, I felt like it would... I mean, I just felt like, I'd like to live here, but it would destroy me. I can't handle this. I'm not old enough to handle this.
It's been a very popular destination for all the trendy young people from Melbourne to go there and try and, I don't know if they think they're going to make it, or at least try and conquer it in some sort of way. It's like, and it seems almost like, even though a lot of the time it's obviously based in...
it's just survival, right?
It's the same old thing about, trying to make a career somewhere and get noticed and maybe make a splash in a bigger pond. And I understand all of that.
Well, the opportunities are large too.
Yeah, they are. But I mean, there's a lot of loud voices to compete with, and some of the best qualified voices as well.
Right.
Although I have heard some pretty funny stories that kind of demystify the level of qualifications that you might associate with the people there, but
isn't that the art world in general? Once you peel the facade back, people are running around, kind of half know what they're doing half the time. And
yeah, probably.
I feel like as I get older and see more of the way things work,
I think language has a lot to do with that. I mean...
presentation.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of the market or the world, the art world, in that sense, yeah, of course, there's a lot of presentation. But even in criticism and the academic sort of circle around the actual process of making things or creating situations,
it's hard to be good at anything you do.
Then there's a kind of, there's just a disconnect that happens between what seems to be going through most artists' heads and how they work and the kind of methods and strategies they employ to communicate and make work is often, not as closely linked to a kind of literal linguistic understanding as what, art history and the history of art criticism would like. And not that they're unaware of that, not that the critics know that, but it's just that at the end, it feels like there's a facade on art practice because it's always filtered through this language machine and this sort of
international arts English.
Yeah, and that's just a problem. I mean,
it's a huge problem.
I mean, people just should go to museums and galleries and any kind of grassroots events or anywhere you can see something being made and see it in the flesh and think for yourself about what it might mean. And sure, inform yourself, read criticism, read art history, but you have to stand in front of the thing and feel it.
Right. I think it doesn't inform the whole debate. Or talk to the artists themselves if you can. I think that's I think that's what you're trying to kind of do in a way. So I think have you heard the saying that art criticism or criticism in general is the intellectual's revenge on the artist?
I haven't heard the saying. It seems pretty cynical. It's
heavy-handed, but in a way, it's kind of like, because like a lot of artists don't necessarily think along the lines of the current arts discussion, or anytime, perhaps you make art because you don't have anything else you can do, or even more, you do it because you can't control it, or it's completely thoughtless. It's not allowed to be meaningless. Art is not allowed to just exist on its own.
But my comment would be that it's, even if, many artists will say, and historically this is on record, like Jasper Johns and many other people have made really significant contributions to the critical direction and the critical engagement with art in an intellectual way. They've been interpreted in that way. Many have said that then that's you can read that if you want, and that's not really what I'm going for.
Right.
But I also think that is that's also a little bit tongue in cheek. I think what that really means in many cases isn't that I'm an artist, I'm not engaged with intellectual discourse, or I'm not necessarily trying to orient my work in a larger cultural framework. I'm just making stuff.
Right.
But I think what that actually means is I'm absorbing everything. I'm filtering everything. I'm thinking about everything, and every decision is made deliberately. Mm-hmm. But if I could write that down, I wouldn't be painting. Right. I wouldn't be doing whatever else I'm doing.
Right.
And that's not my mode.
That's an interesting way of putting it.
And so it's all going in, and I'm making all these relationships, and I can't understand what they all are all of the time. And sometimes, you look, when I look at drawings and things I made when I was in art school or whatever, and which is getting on 10 years ago, and I'm decoding things about myself from that time that I could never understand or articulate at that time.
But didn't you meet when you were in art school the people who couldn't articulate it even if they tried? They couldn't even bullshit it? Because for me, when I went to art school, it was very important that you could decode your own work and present it, open it up a little bit and present a package, because the debate had to go upon your intention. You were never allowed to present a work and just leave the room and have everyone debate about it or anything like that. You had to unpack it a little bit.
I think it's important to take responsibility for what you do.
Sure.
I know that's not really what you're asking, but I think that's the most crucial point in that room.
But it just seems like people who had talent and had heart couldn't always function in the, okay, let's say art school is a small skewed mirror for the art world at large. They couldn't function in that format. They couldn't really, they got shit on because there's the kids who could talk the talk, but couldn't walk the walk, and vice versa. And they were always at odds with each other.
I definitely think it helps you in any aspect of the art world if you can articulate what you're trying to do in some way. And usually the simplest way is the best, in my opinion, because you're going to be able to be understood by the most people, basically.
There's a problem
all
with
the
that.
great minds I've met or even read can, don't need a lot of complicated kind of reference points to be able to say something very clear but very deep.
What do you think about the current state of art right now in terms of that? Do you have to have a somewhat convoluted point, or are you able to simply express an idea?
It's a good question. I'm quite happy with everything. I'm quite happy with Sunday painters who just paint vases of flowers, to be honest. I don't think that, I'm not sure that the kind of value systems that we've got for art are very relevant to artists. What I do think is important increasingly is a level of critical engagement with what you're doing. I think that you need to be able to understand the...
on a personal level.
With your own work. I think
Right.
you need to be able to understand how what you make is affected by and feeds into what's come before you, and because you're just going to make better work if you're aware. But and to be aware of the kind of, at least the core writing about illusionism. If you're sitting around making photographic drawings like I've spent a lot of my time doing, and you don't know about art and illusion or any of the kind of key essays about these kinds of ideas, then there's a chance that your work comes off a little naive, because there's going to be a lot of the audience members who do have that, and trompe l'oeil is just not really that interesting to them.
Right.
But on the other hand, whatever you're doing, and I think this is the key point, that when you're inside of that, when you're listening and listening to and reading, writing about art, essays about art, philosophy of art, then there's a very good chance that the work you make is going to be about art too.
Right.
And if that's all it's about, then your ability to reach and move people who are from other walks of life is limited.
Right.
And I think that while I think that there's just a natural kind of whirlpool that happens in any field where the academe and the criticism and the theorizing around a subject sucks to the center those artists whose work feeds into the kind of academic critical discourse most easily, because it can be written about, it can be talked about, and those artists become popular, I think.
That makes a lot of
quite
sense.
a lot. But I think there's many cases of artists who are doing things which are, or who have done at least, which are important engagements with that history of art, and they think about aesthetic and formal and conceptual developments from previous movements, but they also are able to execute themselves in a way that's succinct enough and has some universal elements enough to engage people from on a number of levels and from all kinds of works of life. And to my mind, that's the ultimate thing to strive for, something which is
both forward-looking and backwards-looking.
Well,
or at least relevant.
Equally relevant to a general public and a so-called informed art public.
I think that's a great goal to have. I mean, everything you're saying makes a lot of sense. I struggled on a couple of, like, for me, I have a really hard time with the criticism versus accessibility issue. For me, in my normal mode of being and my job, I see art every day. And I will not hesitate to look at something and be like, this is terrible. I don't want anything to do with this. But at the same time, in my heart, I'm like, this person should do this. I really want them to enjoy doing this. Art is accessible for everyone. And so part of me is like very judgmental. The other part's like, good for you, and like, I kind of struggle with this issue. And I think regardless of how I feel about it, the bigger issue is that art is becoming a bit inaccessible to your average person. I feel like
accessible to people making it, or to people who want to make it,
to the general public,
or people who view it.
People who view it, because the debate is becoming more and more insular and more closed off and more self-referential, to a point in which, like the example that really struck me was when I was in art school. I'd been there for 2 years, and I had a good friend from California visiting me in Chicago, where I was going to school, and I went to the Art Institute. They have a big museum there. And I had to work one day or something, so my roommate took my friend to the museum. And she essentially walked in there going, I don't like art, and left going, wow, that was really interesting, because my roommate took her around and was like, okay, this is what this person was trying to do. This is what's going on here. This is how this relates to the other things, and contextualized things for her. And she found it very interesting. But before that, when she just walked up to it, it didn't say much to her.
I think that's interesting. I mean, there's a lot being written and said about, whether or not, even in the sort of purest forms of psychology and things, about whether art is code, or whether art is a code. And it seems there's some consensus. This is very secondhand what I'm telling you, so I couldn't tell you from source material if it's true. It's not my interpretation, but I've heard people say that, respected scholars say that it's generally not understood that way in psychological terms. I can't explain exactly why.
How is it understood
then? My thinking is that it's about specificity. Specificity? There we go.
Yeah.
It's about narrowing things. It's about that whirlpool. That if you're having a conversation like we're having one, and everybody is very informed about a subject, you can just keep mining deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Right. I think that's what scholarship's all about. Sure. We should be promoting a level of thinking which, is very detailed, and which
makes it naturally
interrogates the subject. Yeah, but I mean,
to someone who's not initiated into the discussion or the topics or the given points.
Yeah. I mean, of course, there's a big gap. I mean, my uncle sent me a couple of days ago a joke email, that was basically an online quiz to detect whether or not a painting had been made by a toddler or by a modern artist, And I mean, 9 out of 10 paintings were de Koonings,
right?
And he told me that he got them all wrong, And I mean, these are to most people who grew up with even in like high school art, you'd have seen at least 3 or 4 of these de Koonings, And I mean, for many of the artists that I look up to, he was their idol,
Right.
And has just been a huge figure. I mean, it's impossible to imagine that,
right.
That he wouldn't be an important part of, at least the last 50 years of art history,
right.
or basic education. I mean, he's just such a massive figure. But I mean, you've got to realize that that's your mainstream angle. And
right.
So do you try to engage people with who can't recognize a de Kooning painting do you try to engage them in a long-winded lesson about the semantics of art history and art criticism,
Right.
or do you find a way to use those tools to catch on to things which do relate to their everyday existence, but but which may equally remind the scholars among us and the art lovers among us of a bunch of key points of modernism, for example, or may reference certain kind of metaphysical writing or something that's been part of the cultural discourse. I mean, those things can be in the work at the same time that very simple things are in the work. And I mean, if the arts aren't about communicating basic things like love and life and death and all those primal things, I mean, and nature and order and all that, I mean, these are core things.
Right.
The kind of language and discourse about shifts in post-minimalism are interesting to artists and people who study art, because they tell us something about how things were made before, how other people have approached the problem of making new things, how you make something new, how you do something different, etc. But I mean, expecting everybody to go into a museum and realize that this thing which now looks completely old hat, it was like some kind of important revolution at the time and therefore they should value it, isn't the case. I mean, if it doesn't, some work was just off its time. It doesn't have to move everyone. And I don't think we have to be obsessed with, trying to get people to catch up.
Right. Well, that's been my personal...
We should just be better at communicating and bridging that gap.
Right. Well, that's been my personal solution. I, after art school, really kind of dropped out of art, at least on any sort of intellectual level. I went through the motions physically because I enjoyed being in the darkroom. I enjoyed taking pictures, but I stopped looking into who was making art, what was about, what any sort of discussion there was. And I'm only coming back to it now because I felt alienated by it. I really felt like I've always had this issue about not exactly being a intellectual when it comes to art, but being very interested. And I'm just coming back now on my own terms and saying, okay, you're never going to be as strong intellectually discussing art as someone who does this all the time or has a job doing it or takes a great interest. But it doesn't mean you can't decode it in your own way, have your own relationship to it, and enjoy a discussion about it. I obviously know more than your average person, so I feel like I'm stuck in the middle. I've got, a connection to the completely unwilling to know
the language, but you don't really want to talk that much.
Yeah, and I just don't really see what it's good for in a lot of cases. It seems like gobbledygook a lot of the time. I'm really, Somerset Maugham, the author, his whole goal was to write as simply as possible, and I really enjoy that. Like you said, you also said that earlier. Explaining an idea clearly, there's no reason to make it convoluted. And that doesn't mean it doesn't have to be intelligent. It's that fine balance between you can have it be extremely intelligent or specific, but it doesn't have to be convoluted.
Yeah.
And I feel like art's discussion has become convoluted.
There can be, the only problem with making things which can be widely appreciated is that it can make them quite general at times.
Sure.
It can tend towards generality.
Sure.
And that doesn't work if you've got something very detailed or specific to say.
Sure.
And I think there's places for all of it. And I don't think that people have to be. I'm usually pretty happy if people look at what I do and ask the question: "Is this art? Why is this art?" Or all those questions are kind of as important tools and have been important tools throughout the last 150 years of kind of modernism through to whatever we have now, in shaping and reshaping and allowing freedom in interpreting what we think is good, what we don't think is good, what moves us. I mean, it was only 150 years ago that if something wasn't perfectly rendered, then it was just unacceptable.
Right.
Now, one of the most interesting thing you said before was that you just stayed at it because you were making things. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's at the core. I make art because I like making things. It's why I started. And even the most conceptually based practices seem to be driven still by a kind of a rhythm of process, even if that process is a bit hands off.
Absolutely.
And I think that rhythm of process, whether it's time in the studio painting, or whether it's planning, or whether it's going to manufacturing plants and seeing what different materials do, or talking to a philosopher about their recent PhD thesis, or whatever it is that's helping you get to where you want to go, or that at least tickles your fancy,
or not doing anything.
You got to follow
maybe
the nose, and
Right.
that's what making things is doing, because each time you're making these vast range of subtle decisions and subtle choices, and I mean, there's a whole, I think that's at the core. The process is sort of often spoken about in a way that tends to limit it to sort of manual processes or physical work making. And I don't think that's relevant. I think that it's the making that counts. And the reason you get John saying, I just want to make paintings kind of thing, it's not really, and this kind of trope that sort of this tongue-in-cheek artist saying, oh, it's not really about anything. And,
Right.
I'm amazed.
Coy smile, wink, wink.
Yeah. And I mean, sometimes it isn't about anything as it's described to the artist by the critic reviewing their work. Maybe all of the stuff that the critic said is completely interpretation.
Right.
But that's what art's for.
Right.
Art's for stimulating different kinds of interpretations.
Sure.
I think the problem lies in when the execution of projects doesn't facilitate a kind of an easy reading as well as a more detailed reading.
Sure.
And I think that I shouldn't say easy, that a direct reading as well as a more as well as a reading you might have to search for.
Right.
And I think that that there's a risk sometimes with the level of kind of criticism and academe associated with the art world and the impetus on conceptually based practice, that the artist forgets that they're also thinker and executor,
right,
at the same time,
and judge.
And sometimes the execution suffers a little bit. I think in the eyes of the artist, so as not to interfere with the purity of the concept.
Right.
But in my view, it's often that execution and finding the best way to transmit what you're trying to say. Not just one way, not just a way that you think kind of might look good, or that you think looks like other art you've seen, or that you think doesn't look like art, or whatever it is you're trying to go for.
Right.
Often it's the execution which brings in those people who, and I'm not talking about any particular kind,
right,
but finding the best way to express what you're trying to express, I think, is as important as the message. Otherwise, it doesn't get through a lot of the time.
Well, let's talk about this, because you mentioned earlier that when you make a drawing and if it raises the debate about whether it's art at all, that is a success. It's a sign of success for you. Vaguely, that's what I understood, at least.
I find it satisfying. It's successful in the sense that it's encouraging people to ask questions for themselves about the world and
right,
about whether or not something fits into it. It's not about whether they like something I've made because I want to be proud of it and because I want them to think I'm a great artist, But I wouldn't say it's, what I'm aiming for. But
right,
I think that it's, even if that's the sort of base response to things you do, that's at least engaging people.
It's a sign of some sort of success for the work.
You're communicating with people.
Right.
I mean, we've seen sort of shock tactics and a lot of ugly stuff, but...
Sure.
But
let's take it a couple steps back. When, I kind of want to steer this, obviously, around to being about you, too. What was it that drew you into making art, your own art, in the first place? Was there ever a conscious decision? Did you ever say, gee, I think I want to be an artist? And I mean that in the capital A sense. I want to try to make a living. I want to go to art school. I want to...
I think I want to be an artist came quite a bit after art school.
Why'd you go to art school then?
I kind of pursued art because I enjoyed drawing, essentially.
Okay.
You know, and it was something which I was better than average at when I was a kid. Okay. I mean, very simply, like most artists probably, or a lot of people who get interested. And I kept doing it. I enjoyed doing it. I enjoyed the kind of solitariness of, and the kind of concentratedness of like.
Did you also do it when you were in your teenage years, 14, 15, 16, 17
years old?
Yeah, I did.
I always drew.
Okay.
And I mean, that went through all kinds of cycles and fads and interests. Sure. But I mean, yeah, it was always part of my life. And then in high school, I had some really, I really didn't, you know, high school was a funny time in terms of how I related to a lot of my superiors and stuff. But I had some cool art teachers.
Is that code for you talked back and you didn't like your math teacher and you put pins in her cushion?
I was just an adolescent.
Sure.
I was just trying to work things out.
Yeah.
And trying to be an individual in a kind of environment that was about making you the same as everyone else, and it pissed me off. But
you found solace in the art classes somehow.
The art classes it was much freer. And I was encouraged because I had some basic aptitude for line and proportion and space, and I could do these sort of formal things that I'd been practicing since I was a kid, you know, quite by accident or without knowing really what I was doing. But it's also in my family. The idea of being an artist was not that foreign. Like it wasn't a big jump. When I got to finishing high school, I was like, I want to go to art school, and I didn't get into the art school I wanted to go to when I finished, and went and tried some other stuff and did some traveling and did some other courses and worked pretty hard, and knew I didn't want to do that.
Backbreaking work.
Yeah, I mean, it was good. It's very good for you to get your hands dirty. But no, it stayed with me. I wanted to go to art school, and then when I left art school, I think I actually wanted to be a graphic designer, and that's kind of what I started doing. I was doing kind of commercially oriented, applying visuality, but I wasn't ready for thinking about it in a more self-sufficient kind of a sense, where the art just had to stand for its own sake. Kind of like the idea of applying it or making things that were functional, which I still in some ways do, but not so much to a commercial end. And I realized there were so many great graphic designers out in the world that was just not a race I needed to run. So it just became clear that
did you make
the best way to exercise. I left Australia. I got a grant actually to go to Europe for 12 months, traveling and learning and doing mentorships and residencies and things.
And that's
great. I mean, it wasn't specifically for that, but I kind of managed to design a project and I got funded. And that was up until that point after art school, I'd been working, you know, doing commercial art. And that was like, I was planning to take my laptop with me, you know, and do client work on the side and all that sort of stuff while I was traveling around to make some money and stuff. And my wonderful girlfriend was just like, you got this money to do what you want to do. Like, don't waste your time doing that.
Don't fly to Paris and do.
And I'm like, but what about all my clients? And I mean, we're talking about who cares stuff, you know. Right. Anyway, so I was like, all right, I'm not gonna do
probably a
design
really good
for a
decision
while.
Right there.
And it was a hard one because I actually had to face up to it. You know? I had to actually confront it in a way that it wasn't something that I wished I was doing more of, but that I didn't really have time to do. And so whenever I got a chance, I'd do something. Right. I had to start to own it.
Face it.
That's. I think that's when I would say that's when my work started to be a bit more accountable.
And when was this approximately?
About 2010.
Okay, so this is fairly recent.
Yeah.
And so then you...
That's how I would see it.
Right.
Obviously, I was having shows and doing some stuff before then.
Sure, but I relate to that because I feel like I've started 4 or 5 times, and each time I start, I have to like run into a wall and then start over again. And each time I feel like the start over was the beginning. The other times didn't count to some degree. You know, like I've been making photographs since the year 1999.
What does the starting point do? Like, how do you know it's a new starting point? Like, what do you think it is that...
It's erasing the back catalog, and I don't mean it erasing it from my head, but erasing it as relevant, as presentable. And like, work I made then is just not good enough. And when I finally cross the hump, like I can sit there with a body of work and be like, I'm going to have a show, I'm going to present this, and the start over is when I look at it all and go, this is going in the drawer. This was important, but it's useless right now in terms of like getting a show, moving it out there.
You might be surprised how useful that all becomes.
I'm saving it for that. I'm definitely saving it for that. But it has happened that I've like work on a project, work really hard, tear my heart out on it, finish it, shop it around a little bit, and then be like, you know what? It's just not good enough. I'm just canning it.
I think, I mean, there's so many factors and it's quite a personal thing.
Well, I think for me, it helps me get better. It's part of this debate we were talking about earlier, this personal debate you have to have with yourself about the value of what you do.
Yeah. It's also, I think, it's about the rhythm of process.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
You have to be doing enough of it that you're able to make ruthless choices. I mean, one of my lecturers in art school, said, look, Matisse could make 75 drawings a day. How many drawings did you make today?
Right.
And I'd be like, I don't know, I made 3 or 4 centimeters of this drawing today. And he'd just, kind of turn around and I mean, not to say that
some tough love.
Important to churn out work. But what he was getting at was that not everything you make has to be an end point.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, very little of what you make is an end point. And most of what you make is a stepping stone to the next thing you make.
Exactly.
And that the best way to work it all out is by doing it, by starting with the thing you know and adding it, changing it, pushing it closer and further in the directions to where your interests are, taking each step, and pushing it. But you have to kind of, in order to make the some of the lateral jumps and the sort of more dramatic swoops to new places.
Right.
You have to be taking lots of steps and making lots of critical decisions
and leaving
hard
some
on
things
yourself.
behind.
Of course, leaving a lot behind.
Yeah.
And I think that was valuable to me, especially young, because I still work very, very slowly, but I'm reasonably disciplined about making sure there's a certain amount of thinking, even though, right now I'm working full time here in Denmark and my art practice is a bit distracted. I'm still spending a certain amount of time every day completely focused on the project of where my art practice is moving to and from, whether it's concrete projects I've got in the works for the future or whether that's just my ongoing push to try and explore different things. And
well, let's talk about now, because, here you are. You're here because, I wouldn't say through no choice of your own, but you're here through a series of events that led you here, which wasn't necessarily your own. But you've taken to it like a duck to water. You seem to be really enjoying your time here. We got to be sure to plug, you have an artwork right now at the Esbjerg Art Museum, which was completely serendipitous that happened.
Yeah, it was a good opportunity. It came. I don't know. Some people talk about this stuff like that you make your own luck, and there's all these kind of quips about that. I never know any of that, but it's really. I just felt really lucky that they'd seen my work. In fact, they contacted me thinking that I was in Australia and wanted me to send this drawing machine that I'd built in 2009 over to this exhibition that they were curating in Esbjerg. This kind of industrial port town of Jutland.
Right.
And I thought that was bizarre. I was like, well, look, that work's kind of packed up and gone, and I've only got part of it, and that part of it's like in my mum's studio back in Melbourne.
Right. But guess what? I'm in Copenhagen.
Exactly. So stupidly and with no time and no money, we put the heads down and made a new drawing machine for the show.
And how long is the show up for?
It's up until the 12th of January.
What's the name of the show?
Quite a good length of time. It's called What Are You Doing Here? What Am I Doing Here?
What am I doing here?
What Am I Doing Here? Which is, it's curated by a little England-based artist, Nina Saunders, and philosopher, psychoanalyst Ernesto Spinelli. They've co-curated it as part of a series of shows called based around this very broad idea of art and context, but which basically means introducing people into the curatorship field that aren't directly curators, both artists and professionals in kind of parallel areas.
I like this idea.
And it's great. I mean, Esbjerg Museum, I can't speak highly enough of them. They've been incredible, supportive, and they seem to have a really progressive idea about really trying to make the experience of going to a gallery as open and engaging for as many different kinds of people as possible. And as far as I can tell, that doesn't usually equate to watering it down. So
I've heard that.
I think there's real ways to do it. It's just having a good understanding of perception and how people respond to things. And
I've heard that they're well regarded in the art world. What's next? You're unfortunately leaving us soon, and we're very sad about this. I speak on the behalf of all of Denmark. We'd really like it if you'd stay here.
Thanks, man. Look, I hope I'll be able to come back. I've had some pretty good. I've had a great experience here. I really enjoyed it. Both the people and the place, and starting to get to know a little bit the art world, seeing shows here, and getting to meet some really cool artists here, both through the exhibition and working at the Statensverkstedet. These kinds of things, they've been like there's some really great resources here for artists, and I know that it's not always the case that you have opportunities to benefit from them. But by comparison to Australia, the resources behind most of the art world, certainly the public side, seems phenomenal. I'm very impressed by that.
It's a pretty exceptional system in a lot of ways. It's closed, but if you can work something out, it's really, really warm and open, and it's just they'll really put their weight behind you. They'll support you in what you want to do.
Yeah, well, it feels like that. I mean, I'm only just starting to get a sniff of it. But what's next? I'm currently developing quite a big site-specific outdoor installation for the Sydney Biennale, which is a reasonably large arts festival in Australia. And that's mostly what I'm working on. I've been doing some drawings for a show I'm kind of hoping I'll pitch to bring me back here. But
that's what I'm talking about.
We're probably a little way off
right
doing that. But the build for Sydney is considerable. It's a 75-meter installation.
Are you allowed to tell us what it is?
I can tell you I can tell you about it. I'm not supposed to really tell you anything, but who cares? It's
only going on the internet.
It's a project based around. I should tell you that the festival's located mostly on a place called Cockatoo Island, which is a small island with a very mixed history, but in most recent times it's kind of been a shipbuilding and kind of industrial. It's a very small island in the middle of Sydney Harbour in central Sydney. And for the past 50 years it's been, or might have that date wrong, cared for by the National Trust, and in more recent times been used for big events such as the Biennale and some others which I've forgotten. Also been a great site for filmmakers and shooting films, both locally and international films, because it's just got some incredible old industrial architecture and old shipbuilding equipment, which is half dilapidated, and it's got, quarried kind of cliff face hill with a tunnel running through it, and there's all these kind of haunted spaces and
sounds pretty
strange
interesting
things. Anyway, I was really inspired by when I started thinking about the project, about making something ruinous, making a kind of a lived-in space, a space for dwelling or the traces of dwellings, something that would indicate a kind of past civilization or imply that, but in its ruined state, form a new function. Part of what I was asked to do was to activate this long kind of concrete area of what they call the East Apron. But that's kind of turned into something which perhaps has been quite influenced by the earth mounds and burial sites of the north, actually, and the kind of megalithic history of Northern European cultures, not only, but that's been my main experience. So, one of the main components is a kind of burial mound meets minimal sculpture en masse, kind of turf tunnel mega structure, I guess.
Are you working alone, or are you working with other people? Obviously there's more people involved, but are you given a certain space to work individually on? Yeah,
that's kind of how it works. There's lots of different artists, obviously, as part of the Biennale, and I'm probably one of the youngest and riskiest as far as they're concerned.
Yeah.
But the current curator, Juliana Amberg, is she's one of the really strong and informed voices in Australian contemporary art. I mean,
how'd that come about?
She came to see a series of 3 improvised shelters I built in a urban really area in central Melbourne as part of the Next Wave Festival in 2012, which were built from building waste from the sort of ongoing kind of high-rise development that goes on around that area. And it's been a kind of infamous sort of failed metropolis in the old port district of inner Melbourne, which is really very close to the centre of the city. So it's basically a continuation of it. But for various sort of developmental reasons and government decisions, has been widely condemned both by the sort of architecture planning community and by the general public, in terms of just really not being welcoming. And it was a very interesting site then to make sort of vernacular structures, which were in very high contrast to the sort of slick steel and glass architecture that's so isolating about the place. Anyway, and so it grew out of some discussions we had at the shelters. And she was kind enough to invite me and take the risk to let me be involved. But of course, I'll be working with I'm already working with a really great team from the Biennale itself. Hopefully, I'm sure that's going to flesh out more and more the more hands-on I get in early December.
When's that happening? The actual opening?
I think the opening date is the 24th of March. So I'm kind of going back to Australia to spend the summer in residence in Sydney at Artspace, and building the installation along with the team on Cockatoo Island for the 3 months.
January
come
to March. June next year, you'll be back here. something like that.
Yeah, look, I'd love to make it back in time for next summer. If next summer's if this summer's any indication.
Oh yeah, it's never an indication here. That's what they say.
Yeah, well, it sounds like we've been spoilt.
Yeah.
It was very nice.
All right, well, do you want to tell the people how to find you? A little bit of plug here, a little website, something like that?
Yeah, you can check out josephlgriffiths.com.
Yeah, we'll put a link up to
.com. Sure, that'd be nice. Any feedback's good feedback.
Yeah. Tell him his art isn't art. He likes that.
Thanks for the chat, man.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it too.
Yeah. All right. Now, what did I tell you guys? What did I tell you about Joseph over there? We hope he comes back, so feel free to write him an email. There'll be a link to that on our show notes for this page, and write him and say, Joseph, come back to Denmark, huh? You can say that the Undergang sent you. And all right, that's it. We are working on all sorts of crazy shit to make this show better. It's true, the intro is going to be retired. We are making a new one. We're also working on getting a new season of guests here. I am personally trying to sharpen my skills. We're trying to be a little more focused here. A little less Rambletown from me. And that's it. So, we hope you guys enjoy the reruns. We want to keep active and keep you guys engaged. And as always, feel free to reach out. Send us an email. Catch us on Twitter. Do what you got to do. This week's episode produced by Undergang Unlimited. Intro and outro music provided by MGT Beats. And the interstitial music this week provided by The Insider. Links to that on our website. What's our website? www.undergang.net. Everything related to the show you can find there. There'll be links for the new podcasting app. There are subscribe buttons. There's comment boards. There's everything you might want. Only other thing, Twitter. Find us on Twitter. We are The Undergang on Twitter. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Catch you next week.